Laozi's hands moved slowly across the surface of the scroll before he unrolled it. He did not rush. In the half-darkness of very early morning, when the sky held that particular quality of deep blue that belongs neither to night nor to day, or sat with the scroll resting across his knees and simply touched it, the way a person might rest a hand on the shoulder of a friend before saying something difficult. The lamp beside him was small. Its light reached only a short distance into the room, and everything beyond that distance was still the ordinary darkness of a life not yet begun. He had been awake for some time already, sitting in the stillness of that hour before the household stirred, before the birds found their voices, before the particular quality of silence that belongs to deep night softened into the lighter, more porous silence of early morning. He had not been thinking. Exactly. He had been attending. There is a difference between the two that takes a long time to feel, and Laozi had spent a great many years learning to feel it, sitting in rooms, watching the way light moved on surfaces, listening to the quality of wind against stone, noticing what remained when thought had been set down and had not yet been picked up again. Now he took one edge of the scroll between two fingers, and he unrolled it. Not with any ceremony, not with the self-conscious gravity of someone performing an act they believe will matter. He unrolled it the way a carpenter draws a plane along a length of wood, with the practiced ease of someone who has done this particular thing many times and is not thinking about doing it, only doing it. The first line appeared. He read it, then he set the scroll down. He rested both hands flat on his knees, and he sat very still, the way a person sits when something is shifted beneath them, and they are waiting to understand whether it is the ground itself or only their understanding of it. Outside, a single bird tested a note and fell silent again. The lamp sent its small orange light against the far wall. Nothing required anything from him. The room held the kind of silence that a question makes when the question has been genuinely asked rather than merely recited, a silence with a different texture from ordinary quiet, fuller somehow, or spacious, the way a room seems larger when the furniture has been taken out and nothing has yet been moved in to replace it. The Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. He had read this line many times. He had written it, and still, each time it arrived, it did the same thing. It withdrew the ordinary floor of meaning from beneath ordinary standing, gently, the way water withdraws from wet sand when the tide goes out, or so that what had seemed perfectly solid proves itself to be something that was only borrowing solidity from what moved through it. This was not a failure of language. Laozi was too careful a thinker for that interpretation. He had not begun his text with an apology. He had begun it with a threshold, a deliberate invitation to step through into a mode of attention in which ordinary naming, ordinary categorizing, ordinary insistence that things be one thing and not another thing falls quiet and something else becomes possible. He knew what naming does. He had spent time with that question, the way one spends time with a difficult neighbor, not happily, not easily, but honestly. A name is a kind of arrest. When something moves and one reaches for the word that fits it, the word holds still while the thing keeps moving, and very quickly the word is no longer in contact with the thing. It is only in contact with the place where the thing was when one reached. This is not the fault of words. It is simply what words are, and what they are is extraordinarily useful, up to the exact point at which it is not. The Tao was what existed before that arrest was possible. It was what existed before there was a reaching, before there was a name available to fit any motion, before the world had been divided into the things that could be pointed at and the spaces between them. And so to say the Tao is this, or the Tao does that, or the Tao resembles the following, all of it was true, and all of it was false in the same motion. The way a hand closed around water is both holding water and already holding something that is no longer quite water. He did not say this to discourage. The first line was not a door locked against entry, but a door held open, an invitation to approach differently, to arrive with the hands open rather than reaching, to accept that what one encounters at this threshold cannot be carried away and examined at the table later, cannot be held up to the lamp to inspect its grain. It is encountered here in the approach, in the quality of attention brought to the threshold, or it is not encountered at all. Outside, the birds were beginning in earnest now. Laozi sat a little longer. There was no particular reason for this, but it was the kind of morning that asked for it, and he had learned, across a long life, to answer what mornings asked. The distinction he had drawn in those first lines was a precise one, and the precision mattered. He had not said that the Tao cannot be spoken of. He had said that the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao, which leaves the speaking intact while quietly unseating the assumption that the speaking captures what it speaks of. There is the unnamed, which is the origin of heaven and earth, and there is the named, which is the mother of the 10,000 things, the 10,000 particular shapes and sounds and movements that fill ordinary experience, the whole proliferating world of stuff and color and sensation that arrives each morning with the light. These two were not opposites. They were not competing descriptions of the same thing. They were the same thing seen from two different directions. The way a mountain seen from the east looks different from the mountain seen from the west, and yet there is only one mountain, and the mountain does not distinguish between the views. The named world, the birds, the lamp, the scroll, the pre-dawn silence, the particular texture of the floor under sitting hands, was not separate from the unnameable ground from which it continuously rose. It rose from it the way a wave rises from water, carrying within its very form the nature of the medium that produced it, expressing in its movement what the deep water was before it reached the surface. Naming, then, is not wrong. It is late. It arrives after the 10,000 things have already been generated, and it describes the generated things with enormous usefulness and considerable accuracy. What it cannot describe is the generating itself, the source from which the things continuously emerge, the still ground beneath the proliferating surface. And what Laozi had understood, sitting in early morning rooms over the course of many years, was that this distinction between the source and what the source produced was not merely a philosophical technicality, but the most practical thing he had ever noticed, because the person who understood it could hold the 10,000 things lightly, knowing that none of them was the last word, none of them the final shape of what was there before them. Many centuries later, and many thousands of miles to the west, in a tradition that knew nothing of Laozi's scroll, a similar understanding arrived by a different route. Theologians and philosophers working in the tradition of apophatic thought, the theology of negation, had arrived at the same difficulty from a different direction, and had applied the same remedy. To speak of the divine through positive description, they found, was to reach for a name that would hold still while the thing named kept moving. The divine was not wise the way a person was wise, not good the way an action was good, not eternal the way a stone was old. Every positive description arrived with its own boundaries, its own finitude, its own implicit suggestion that the thing described could be circumscribed, fitted within the description the way water fills a vessel. And so they turned the language over. They proceeded by removing, they said what the ground of things was not, and in the removing, in the careful, consistent refusal, to let any positive description settle into place permanently, something appeared in the space the removing made. Not a definition, not an image, not a position one could hold and examine, but a quality of openness, a kind of attentiveness to what remained after every insufficient name had been set down. This was not failure. The negative way was not a theology that had given up on its subject. It was a theology that had taken its subject seriously enough to refuse the comfort of inadequate descriptions, that had decided the honest account of what cannot be captured was more truthful than a confident account of something that only resembled what it named. Laozi would have recognized the intention immediately. He might not have recognized every argument, but the quality of attention behind it, the willingness to speak towards something by consistently declining to speak as though one had arrived, that he would have known. The lamp in the early morning room was burning lower. Laozi did not move to tend it. He watched the light on the wall and let the text he had written rest on his knees. And in the quality of attention he brought to the flickering, there was something that the text was trying to teach, expressed without words, more clearly than the words could express it. There is a chapter in the Tao Te Ching, not the first, though it carries the first chapter's argument into the material world, that considers what a wheel is, not in the abstract, concretely. The wheel has a hub, and the hub has spokes that run out from it to the rim, and the whole structure holds together around the center, which is empty. Without the emptiness of the center, the spokes have nowhere to converge. The wheel without its hollow middle is not a wheel. It is only a collection of wood and iron that have no means of turning, or a vessel, a clay pot formed on a wheel, walls rising from the flat spinning surface, the potter's hands shaping the exterior, giving it height and curve, and the particular character of this pot rather than every other pot. But what the pot is for, the reason one reaches for it, the reason it is worth making, is the hollow it contains. The water does not go into the clay. The clay only makes the hollow possible, and the hollow is what holds the water, what gives the clay walls their meaning and purpose and use. Set the pot down empty, and it holds the air of the room. Set it beside the fire, and it holds the warmth. Fill it from a spring, and it holds the cool, clean depth of the source it was filled from. A potter working in a small workshop might not think of this in those terms. She turns her wheel, raises her clay, smooths the walls with wet hands, and the pot takes its shape under her attention through the long, slow, skilled conversation between her hands and the material. When it is done, she sets it on the shelf to dry and looks at what she has made. What she looks at, if she is honest, is mostly the absence she has made, the particular size and shape of the hollow that the clay surrounds, the specific quality of the space that will hold what it is made to hold. A room, in the same logic, 4 walls, a floor, a ceiling. The room is made of these. But no one lives in the walls, no one sleeps in the floor. The room is used through the space the walls describe and contain, and a house full of rooms is a house full of organized absences, structured voids that human activity fills and empties and fills again, each room carrying its own particular quality of silence, its own way of holding light in the afternoon, its own character as a place where things can happen because there is space for things to happen in. Laozi was not pointing toward emptiness as an aesthetic preference. He was not saying that less is more in some decorative sense. He was making a structural claim about how the world worked, grounded in the most ordinary objects one could hold in one's hands, a wheel, a vessel, a room. The useful part of each was the part that was not there. The work done by the form was the work of making the void possible, of organizing the absence into something that could receive and hold and serve. And the Tao itself was this, carried to its furthest extent, not the absence of anything in particular, but pure generative potential. The void that was not empty in any privative sense, not lacking something that should be there, but full of what had not yet become. The way a room before any human being has ever entered it is not empty of what it will hold, but simply prior to it, waiting without urgency or effort for whatever will come. In the same chapters of the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu reaches for another image, a bellows, the leather and wood instrument of the forge, the thing that draws air in and sends it out to feed the fire, the breathing of the metal worker's craft. The bellows is empty when it is drawn back, it is full when it is pressed forward, and it never runs out. It does not deplete the air is inexhaustible, will not diminish with use, will be there for the next breath, and the next one after that, and the one after that one, as long as the forge needs feeding. In a blacksmith's workshop, in the particular smell of hot iron and coal, and the rhythmic labor of hammer on anvil, there is a moment between the drawing of the bellows and the next press forward, a small pause, a held breath in the instrument itself, a moment of suspension when the fire neither advances nor retreats, but simply burns, held by what surrounds it, fed by what was just sent into it, waiting without impatience for what will come. The fire does not wonder whether the next breath will arrive. The fire simply continues, in the pause as fire. The Tao Te Ching holds this image up and says, the Tao is like this, the space between, the drawing and the pressing, the pause and the motion, and it never runs out. The 10,000 things pour from it, the way breath pours from a bellows, continuously, without diminishment, without calculation or effort, the source not depleted by what it produces, but remaining in itself the same, inexhaustible, prior to everything that comes from it, not altered by the alteration of anything it has made. This is not easy to hold in a single image for very long. It is the nature of such ideas that they slip from the grasp each time they seem to have been caught, not because the ideas are flawed, but because the grasping itself is what loses them. The way holding a bird more tightly than the bird requires is how the bird is damaged. One notices the image of the bellows and then finds that what one is noticing is only the image, and the Tao has moved on the way the Tao does. A woodworker in a small room, sometime before the hour when the world grew busy, sat at a workbench with a plank of wood before him. He was not working yet. He held a lamp close to the surface and turned the wood slowly, watching the grain emerge under the moving light, lines that had been there for decades, for the entire life of the tree before it became a plank, laid down season by season in the growth of the living wood. Darker lines where growth had slowed in the cold of winter, lighter lines where the warm seasons had let the tree expand. These lines were not put there by anyone. They were not chosen or arranged. They were the record of the tree's passage through its own life, each line the answer the tree had given to the particular year that had made it. He traced the grain with one finger, following the lines, the way one follows the thread of a thought before deciding whether to pursue it. He was reading the wood. What he read told him where the wood would yield easily and where it would resist, where to take the plane and where to take the chisel, what the grain would do under pressure in each direction. He was not yet working. He was arriving at the material, letting the material tell him what it already was, so that what he made would come from what was already there, rather than being imposed on what was already there against its nature. This quality of attention, prior to action, prior to tool, prior to the first cut, was what the tradition that Lao Tzu had built was in part about. Not the refusal to act, not the preference for inaction as an end in itself, but the deep attentiveness to what already was before any action was added to it, the reading that precedes the making, the listening that precedes the response. There is a Western tradition that had arrived from very different materials at a related place, not the same place, not through the same arguments, but adjacent, sharing a quality of attention rather than a body of doctrine. The apophatic theologians of the Christian and Neoplatonic inheritance had developed a practice they called the negative way, and at its heart was a discipline of refusal, the refusal to let any finite description hold permanently in the place where the infinite was being sought. They stripped away the names one by one, not with despair, but with a kind of rigorous patience, and what they were left with when the stripping was complete was not nothing. It was something closer to openness, something that could receive what no named thing could. Meister Eckhart, the medieval German mystic, wrote of the Godhead, the ground of being, prior to any of the named attributes of God, in terms that would not have been unfamiliar to someone reading the first chapters of the Tao Te Ching. The ground was prior to all description. It was not this or that. It was the source from which this and that continuously arose, without itself being exhausted or changed by the arising. He was not speaking of the same thing Lao Tzu was speaking of, but he was facing the same direction, drawn there by the same honest confrontation with the limits of what language could hold, and the quality of the facing was shared across the centuries and the distance between them. These convergences are not small things. They are worth sitting with, the way the woodworker sat with the grain of the wood before beginning, not yet doing anything with what he found, just attending to the fact of it. When thinkers working in isolation from one another, in different languages, from different premises, within different traditions and practical concerns, arrive at a similar quality of attention through radically different routes, the similarity does not mean they have all found the same rock beneath the different soils. It means something about the nature of the question, that it has a character of its own that produces similar responses in those who press themselves seriously against it. The question shapes those who hold it, which may be a part of what both traditions, in their different ways, were trying to say. The lamp in Lao Tzu's room was very low now. The first light of dawn had begun to feel itself into the windows, not yet visible, not yet anything that could be called light, but present in the quality of the darkness, which had shifted from the thick, unreachable dark of deep night to a thinner dark, more like the inside of a closed eye than the inside of a sealed room. He did not move to replace the lamp. The darkness that was coming was not darkness the lamp could prevent. He had been sitting with the image of a well. In the text he had written, among the images that came to him, for what the Tao was, or rather for what the Tao was like, since what the Tao was could not be said directly. There was a well, stone walls encircling a shaft sunk through the earth. At the bottom, water, not water placed there, but water arrived there, water following its own nature to the lowest point, gathered in the dark below the surface of everything visible. One sent the bucket down, and the bucket came back full. One sent it down again, and it came back full again. The water was not diminished by having been drawn. The drawing did not exhaust the source. There was always more, or rather, the question of more and less did not apply to the source, which was prior to questions of quantity, prior to the accounting of what had been taken and what remained. In a stone courtyard, somewhere in China, in a time that carried none of the weight of being history yet, a well stood at the center of an ordinary household. Night had settled completely over the courtyard. The stones of the walls held the last warmth of the day, releasing it slowly into the cooling air. In the dark bowl of the well's opening, the sky was reflected. A small circle of stars, closer to the hand than they looked from any other angle, held there in the dark water at the bottom of the shaft, which was itself held in the darkness of the earth, which was held in the larger darkness of the sky. The stars moved through. The reflection was still. The stars it reflected moved, but so slowly that no single hour of watching could confirm it. The water was quiet, the stars quiet in the water, the courtyard quiet around the water, and the depth of the shaft extending downward into the cool dark earth below everything visible. The well was not empty. It was not, precisely speaking, full. The water was only part way up the shaft, leaving a long column of darkness between the surface of the water and the rim of the stone above. But this darkness was not absence. It was the shaft itself, the organized depth that made the water reachable, that connected the surface world of sky and hands in ordinary motion with the deep water below. Without the darkness of the shaft, the water could not be drawn. Without the depth, there was no arriving at what the depth held. Lazi's scroll lay on his knees, with the first line still visible at its edge, in the first pale gray of morning, beginning to reach the paper. The Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. The unnamed is the origin of heaven and earth. The named is the mother of the 10,000 things. These 3 sentences had been written by a man sitting in a room, using a brush and ink, working with the available materials of language, in full knowledge that the available materials could not hold what he was pointing toward. The pointing itself was the gift, not the arrival, because there was no arrival, there was only the direction of the pointing, and the quality of attention one brought to looking where the pointing led. The text did not capture the Tao. The text opened a window in the direction of the Tao and trusted the reader to approach the window without insisting on possessing what they saw through it. This was the threshold Lazi had built at the very beginning of his text, not as an obstacle or an admission of defeat, but as an act of generosity. He was refusing to make the arrival easy. He was refusing to let the first page of the text settle into a definition that the reader could store and carry away and consult later like a map. He was insisting, from the first line, that what was being offered here could only be received in the receiving, that the understanding, if it came, would come in the sitting with the difficulty, not in the resolution of it. The pre-dawn light was now genuinely in the room. Lazi could see the floor, the mat, the far wall, the scroll. The lamp had burned to nothing. He did not need it. The darkness had moved, the way darkness always moved, not departing, but giving way to what had always been approaching, the slow, ordinary arrival of the day, which asked nothing from him and required nothing of the ground it arrived over, which came not because it had decided to come, but because the nature of the world was this continuous turning, this unremarkable return of light after darkness that had been happening without decision or effort or calculation since before any name for it existed. He sat in it. The first birds had found their full voices now, several of them at once, the sound filling the courtyard outside, filling the early air with the particular quality of life that was neither urgent nor casual, but simply fully itself, singing from whatever it was that made a bird sing, from the irreducible nature of the thing doing the singing, the expression of its own particular being in the particular air of this particular morning. Somewhere in the city, a potter was setting water to boil. Somewhere, a woodworker was arriving at his bench. The day was beginning to fill with its 10,000 particular things, all of them arising from the same ground, all of them carrying within their specific shape and weight and sound the nature of the source they had risen from, all of them moving through their particular lives in the great continuous motion of everything that moved, which was the Tao expressing itself in the only way it ever expressed itself, by generating without exhaustion everything there was. And below the city, below the courtyard, below the still morning air and the birds and the beginning light, down through the dark shaft of the well, past the reach of any lamp, past the point where the sky's reflection held still in the water's surface, the water continued, cool and quiet and undiminished in the dark, not waiting for anything, not withholding anything, simply there, the way the source of things was simply there, full of what had not yet been drawn, patient with the patience of something that had no need to be patient, because the drawing and the waiting were both the same to it, both expressions of the same inexhaustible depth. The morning continued to arrive. The light reached further into the stone courtyard, touching the rim of the well, moving slowly down the outer walls of the shaft, reaching without hurry toward the surface of the water below. The water did not move toward the light. The light came to it, in time, because light moved and water waited, and because the nature of each was to do precisely what it did without requiring the other to be different. Nothing in the courtyard asked anything of anyone. The birds sang because that was what they were. The light arrived because that was what it did. The water held its depth and its quiet and its particular quality of darkness that was not absence, and it would hold it through the whole length of the day that was arriving, and through the night that would follow the day, and through the day that would follow the night after that, unchanged by any of it, unchanged by the drawing that drew from it, and the rain that replenished it, and the seasons that passed above it, without once reaching all the way down to where the water was quiet and old and full of what had not yet been asked for. Heraclitus stood at the edge of a river near Ephesus in the early morning, barefoot on wet stones, watching the water move past him in the pale light before the sun had fully cleared the hills. The stones beneath his feet were cold. The current ran close and quick around his ankles, pressing against him with a steady indifference, neither welcoming nor hostile, simply moving as it had been moving before he arrived, and would continue moving long after he had gone back inside. He stood there for a while without thinking anything in particular, only watching the light break and reassemble on the surface, only feeling the particular sensation of water that is never the same water twice, pressing against the same pair of feet. It was out of mornings like this, or mornings very much like this, that one of the oldest surviving thoughts in Western philosophy emerged. Not from a library, not from a debate, from the bank of a river, the cold press of moving water, and the slow recognition that what he was standing in and what he had stepped into a moment ago were not, in any strict sense, the same thing. The river had a name. The river had a bed and banks and a general direction. But the water itself, the actual water, the specific cold molecules running across those specific wet stones, that water was already gone, replaced by water that had not yet been there a breath before, replaced in turn by water that was still somewhere upstream, not yet arrived, not yet here, already on its way. This was not, for Heraclitus, simply an interesting observation about rivers. He was not making a note about hydraulics or the behavior of moving water in limestone terrain. He was pointing at something much larger, something he believed ran through every observable thing in the world, from the smallest flicker of flame in a household lamp to the slow wheeling of the stars overhead. Change, he was arguing, is not something that happens to things. It is not an interruption of the natural state. The natural state is change, continuous and total, and without exception, and the apparent stability of any object, the river, the rock on its bed, the man standing in the current, is not a fact about the object itself, but a kind of averaged impression, a smoothing out that happens in perception. He put it simply, or as simply as anything of that magnitude can be put. One cannot step into the same river twice. The words have come down across 25 centuries, worn smooth by repetition, and it is possible to hear them now with something less than full attention, to let them pass as a familiar saying rather than a claim with real weight. But held carefully against the light, they are stranger and more demanding than they first appear. The river looks the same, the banks are in the same place, the sound of the water is the same sound, the name is the same name, and yet the water, the actual substance of the thing that is called the river, is entirely different water, having traveled from somewhere else, heading somewhere beyond here, passing through the designation of river, the way a parade passes beneath a window, the window staying fixed while the procession moves endlessly beneath it. Heraclitus was born sometime around 535 BCE in Ephesus, in what is now western Turkey, and he wrote in a style so compressed and deliberately difficult that even his contemporaries called him Heraclitus the Obscure. He left behind a single work, now lost, from which only fragments have survived, passed down through quotation and commentary, so that what remains of his thought is already filtered through other minds, already slightly bent by transmission. There is something appropriate about this. A philosophy of constant flux, surviving only in fragments, passed through hands that changed it in the passing, the philosophy and its history rhyming quietly with each other. He was known for keeping to himself, how for refusing the kind of civic engagement that was expected of educated men of his station, for a manner that struck people as cold or contemptuous, though whether that coldness was genuine or the appearance produced by exceptional seriousness is something no one can say now. What he did not keep to himself was the thought itself, and the thought was this: beneath the constant changing surface of things, there operates a principle of organization, a governing logic that he called the Logos, which keeps the world's flux from dissolving into mere chaos. The river changes completely, moment to moment, but it remains a river, recognizable, coherent, following its course, because something holds the pattern of its changing in a consistent form. The Logos is not a thing in the river. It is more like the reason the river is the shape it is, the intelligence, if that word can be stretched to fit, inside the motion itself. Everything changes. The principle of changing does not change. That tension between the absolute flux of particulars and the consistency of the Logos that organizes them is where Heraclitus found his ground. There is a morning somewhere on the other side of the world, and the other side of history, where a different mind arrived at something that holds a surprising and unrequested similarity to what Heraclitus found on his cold riverbank in Ephesus. The Tao Te Ching, written in China sometime in the 4th or 5th century BCE, though the exact date, like so much of what surrounds it, is a matter of genuine uncertainty, opens with a problem about naming, and then spends 80 more chapters circling the thing that cannot be named. What the Tao is cannot be said directly. It is the source from which all things arise, the current beneath all currents, the ordering principle behind what is observed without being itself observable. The Tao does not act on things from outside them. It is the way things act, the how of movement, the internal logic of the world's unfolding. Chapter 8 sets this aside for a moment and reaches for an image. The highest good, it says, is like water. The image is not decorative. It is chosen with great care from among all possible things, because water does something that no other common substance does quite so clearly. It benefits all things without competing with them. It does not seek the high places where value and status accumulate, but moves always toward the low, the overlooked, the places others have passed over, finding its level with a patience that cannot be distinguished from indifference. Water does not prefer. It does not push its way forward. It does not assert priority or claim reward for what it does, and what it does, quietly, without announcement, is sustain nearly everything that lives. The sage, the Tao Te Ching suggests, moves in the same way, not by imposing, not by pressing, not by insisting on a particular course and holding it against resistance, but by being genuinely receptive to the shape of the world as it is, moving where the opening appears, withdrawing when the way is closed, and in that yielding motion arriving at a kind of effectiveness that force cannot match. This is not passivity dressed up as wisdom. It is a genuinely different account of how efficacy works, one that requires more attentiveness than assertion, more discipline than aggression, more trust in the nature of things than confidence in one's own plan for them. Water shapes the world not by wanting to, but by being what it is, and being what it is in complete fidelity to the terrain it moves through. Heraclitus had his logos. Laozi had his Tao. The two words come from different languages, different traditions, different centuries, different continents, and they point at different things with different emphasis and reach. But both of them are looking at the same surface, the surface of a world in constant motion, and both of them are arguing that beneath that surface something holds. Something is the consistent form of all the changing. Something can be moved with and not against. They arrived at this without knowledge of each other, without translation, without the kind of direct intellectual inheritance that can make two ideas look alike simply because one borrowed from the other. The similarity between them is older than any borrowing. It is the similarity of two careful minds looking at the same river from different banks. The Yellow River, which the Chinese call the Huanghe, is not the same kind of river one might picture in a temperate landscape of green banks and steady current. It runs heavy with silt, a thick yellowish sediment that gives it its name and its character, turning the water opaque for much of its length. It floods dramatically, changing course across centuries in ways that reshaped entire regions, depositing silt and destroying crops in the same season, giving and taking in a single gesture too large to resist. For the people of the river valleys where early Chinese civilization took shape, the Yellow River was not a background feature of the landscape. It was a central fact of existence, closer to a governing power than a geographic detail, requiring constant attention, demanding a kind of perpetual negotiation between human ambition and natural force. Out of that negotiation came a body of thought about how to read the world, how to attend to its patterns, how to move within its forces rather than simply against them. The I Ching, one of the oldest Chinese texts, is structured around the observation of change. The 64 hexagrams it presents are maps of different configurations of changing and unchanging forces, and the practice of consulting it was a practice of attending very carefully to where in a process of change one currently stood. The river is not incidental to this tradition. It is woven through it, present in the language and imagery, and in the fundamental intuition that the world is something to be read and moved with, rather than something to be subdued. Water imagery in the Tao Te Ching is not chosen because water is beautiful or because rivers make good metaphors. It is chosen because rivers were, for that tradition, the most direct and unavoidable experience of how the fundamental nature of things actually behaves. In a lamplit room, in a different time and a different city, a teacher once held a glass of water up toward the light and asked his students a question. He asked them to say when the water stopped being water. The students looked at the glass. They looked at each other. No one spoke. The question seemed, at first, too simple to require thought, and then seemed, under thought, too complex to answer. If you take a cup of water from a river, is it still part of the river? If you pour it back, has it rejoined something it left? Or is the boundary between cup and river a fiction it moved through without change? If it evaporates and rises and falls as rain and seeps into the ground and runs again in some other river, at what point in that long circulation did it become something other than what it was? The teacher did not offer an answer. He set the glass down on the desk, and the room stayed quiet for a while, and in that quiet the question went on working. The point the teacher was after, or one of the points, since a good question contains several at once, is that the categories that seem most fixed are very often the ones that dissolve most completely under close attention. Water is water until it is steam, ice, cloud, rain, river, sea, cell. The category holds as a useful designation for practical purposes and begins to loosen when followed carefully through the actual processes it participates in. Heraclitus would have recognized the lesson. The Tao Te Ching would have recognized it. The category is a handle placed on something that does not have handles, useful for picking it up, but not accurate as a description of what the thing is in itself, in motion, across time. William James sat at his writing desk in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the late 1880s, watching the afternoon light move in slow bars across the wall of his study. He was working on what would become one of the longest and most carefully argued books in the history of psychology, The Principles of Psychology, published in 1890 after more than a decade of effort, and he had come up against a problem of description that he could not resolve by any of the standard methods available to him. The problem was this: mental life does not arrive in pieces. Thought does not stop and start, does not divide itself into discrete units, the way, for example, a sentence divides itself into words. A thought flows into the next thought without a genuine break, each modified by what preceded it, each coloring what comes after, the whole thing continuous in a way that resists the kind of analysis that requires isolating one element from the others. He had tried to describe this continuity in technical language and found the language inadequate. He had tried to describe it in the language of his own experience, sitting at that desk, watching one thought dissolve into the next without seam, and had come closer, but still not quite arrived. He was looking for a word, not a term of art, not a technical designation, but a word that would carry the actual felt quality of what he was trying to describe, the sense of mental life as something moving, something that cannot be stopped without being changed by the stopping. He reached, finally, for water, not water standing still in a vessel, not water cupped in hands. Both of these change water by the act of containment. He reached for water, moving without a container. He reached for the stream. The phrase he settled on was stream of consciousness. It has since become so embedded in ordinary usage that it is easy to miss the careful precision behind it. He was not saying that the mind is like a stream. That would be an analogy, pretty but dispensable. He was saying something closer to the claim that flow is the actual nature of mental life, that the stream is not a figure of speech placed over a separate reality, but the most accurate description of what the reality actually is. Any attempt to arrest a thought for examination, to hold one idea still long enough to inspect it, changes it. The thought in the stream and the thought cupped in analytical attention are not the same thought, just as the water from the river held in the hands is not quite the same water it was, a moment ago, already warming, already losing the current that was part of its character. James had read widely in European thought and was familiar with the broad landscape of philosophy that preceded him, but he arrived at the stream by a route that was primarily his own, following the problem where it led rather than toward a predetermined answer. What he found there, the continuity, the inseparability of mental events, the way each thought is partially constituted by all the thoughts that surrounded it, rhymes quietly with the river of Heraclitus and with the water of the Tao Te Ching without being derived from either. Three different minds, separated by centuries and continents and disciplines, standing at the edge of the same current and noting that it does not stop. A surveyor in ancient China kneels at the bank of the Yellow River in the season after a great flood. The water has retreated to its ordinary bounds. What remains where the flood passed is a wide apron of newly deposited silt, pale and fine-grained, still faintly damp where the sun has not yet reached it. He presses his palm flat against the surface of this silt and holds it there. The texture tells him something, not everything, but something. The size of the particles tells him how fast the water was moving when it dropped them. Fast water carries coarser sediment. Slow water carries fine. The color tells him something about where the water came from, which tributaries it had gathered to itself, what kinds of earth it had moved through in the mountains. The depth of the deposit tells him something about how long the flood persisted, how much the river had to give before the giving stopped. He is reading, in the compressed and patient record of the silt, a story that the river wrote without knowing it was writing anything. The river did not intend this record. It did not accumulate silt as a gesture toward future readers. It simply moved as it moves, carrying what it carried, depositing what it could no longer hold when the current slowed and the carrying became too much. The record is there because the process was there. The writing is the movement, laid down. The surveyor's palm, pressed into that cool, fine layer, is touching not the river's intention, but the river's nature, which is more reliable than intention, being less subject to revision. There is a quality in the attention that such a reading requires that the Taoist tradition would have recognized as something important. It is a quality of deep receptivity, of attending to what is actually there, rather than to what one hoped or feared would be there. The surveyor is not projecting onto the silt. He is not confirming a theory or gathering evidence for a prior conclusion. He is reading, in the most honest sense, letting the text set the terms of its own reading, receiving what it offers rather than demanding what he needs. The river has no interest in being legible. The surveyor has no interest in the river other than what it actually is. Between these two indifferences, something true and useful passes. The logos that Heraclitus found in his river is something like this principle of organization that the surveyor reads in the silt. It is not visible on the surface. It is not announced. It does not call attention to itself. It is the consistent pattern within the change, the organizing form, that makes the river's deposit legible to anyone patient enough and attentive enough to press a palm into it and hold still. Heraclitus believed that this logos was universal, not only in rivers, not only in the natural world, but in all things, including the motion of human history and the life of the individual person. The principle that organizes is everywhere. Most people, he thought, move through it without seeing it, the way a sleeper moves through the night without knowing what the night contains. James would have had something to say about the sleeper too. Part of what the stream of consciousness implies, one of the threads that follows from it, is that the self doing the experiencing is not a fixed point, standing outside the flow and watching it go by. The self is in the flow. The self is, in a meaningful sense, Constituted by the flow, it is the ongoing, never quite completed process of one thought giving way to the next, each transition shaping what comes after, the whole sequence accumulating into something that feels like a continuous person only because it is continuous, person only because it is continuous, not because there is a stable entity underneath that would persist if the flowing stopped. This is the kind of thought that can, approached with the wrong speed, produce something like vertigo. But James held it with a particular quality of equanimity, the kind that seems to come from having followed a problem honestly for a long time, rather than from having resolved it. The thought that the self is a stream rather than a stone does not need to be frightening. The stream is not less real for being a stream. The river is not diminished by the fact that new water runs through it every moment. The name holds, the banks hold, the character holds. This river, with this particular current and this particular tendency to flood in spring, this particular sound and this particular smell. All of this holds even as every molecule of water that constitutes it at any given moment is different from every molecule that constituted it the moment before. On a winter afternoon, a section of river in a northern landscape has gone quiet at the surface. The cold came gradually and then completely, and the surface of the water froze from the edges inward, the ice thickening through nights of hard frost until the river appeared to have stopped entirely. From above, from the bank, it looks like stillness. The reeds at the margin stand without moving. The surface reflects the pale sky in a single unbroken sheet. Nothing seems to be happening. Beneath the ice, the current continues. The water moves in the particular dark, slow way of rivers in winter, thicker with cold, slower, but not stopped, not even close to stopped. The river continues to carry what it carries. It continues to deposit, to erode, to follow its bed through the land with the same governing logic that has guided it since the land first took this shape. The stillness at the surface is real, but it is not the whole truth of the river. It is a layer placed over a deeper motion, visible from above as stillness, felt from within as the quiet continuation of everything the river has always been doing. Heraclitus chose fire as his central image more often than water, though both run through his fragments. Fire, he thought, was the best demonstration of the Logos in action, always changing, always consuming what surrounds it, and yet always fire, always recognizable, always organized by the same principle into the same dancing shape. But water carries the point differently, more quietly. Fire announces itself. Water works without announcement, and in that quiet working accumulates a kind of authority that fire, for all its immediate drama, cannot match. The Tao Te Ching understood this. The soft overcomes the hard, the yielding overcomes the rigid. Not because softness has more force in the ordinary sense, not because yielding is a secret strategy of aggression, wearing a calm face, but because the nature of things runs in a particular direction, and what moves in that direction moves with an effectiveness that resistance cannot generate. Water does not overcome stone by wanting to. It overcomes stone by being water completely in every moment without deviation or second thought. The effectiveness is a consequence of the fidelity, not a separate achievement layered on top of it. William James, toward the end of a long day at his desk in Cambridge, would sometimes put down his pen and sit for a while in the chair by the window, watching the light change on the street below. He was not thinking, exactly. He was doing something that does not have a precise name in the vocabulary of productive intellectual effort, something closer to allowing, to not directing, to letting the mind run in the way it naturally runs when the organizing intention releases its grip. The stream of consciousness, given the right conditions, is not chaotic. It has its own order, its own governance, its own way of returning to themes and circling back to questions that are not yet resolved. Held loosely, it tends toward coherence. Gripped tightly, forced into a predetermined channel, it loses something essential about itself, something that cannot be recovered by effort. The river at Ephesus, in the early morning, before Heraclitus had formed a single philosophical proposition from what he was experiencing, was doing something like this. The light on the water was not intending to be beautiful. The current was not intending to demonstrate anything. The stones at the bank were not wet in order to communicate the sensation of cold. Everything was simply happening in its fullness, according to its nature, the logos operating as it always operates, not as an external compulsion, but as the internal logic of things being what they are. Heraclitus stood there barefoot, feeling the cold, and something in the quality of his attention turned the ordinary experience of a river in the morning into a philosophical proposition that 25 centuries have not yet finished considering. The stepping in and the stepping out, the same river and the new water, the name that holds and the substance that changes, these are not contradictions to be resolved, but the actual texture of reality which contains both, without strain. What looks like paradox from one angle looks from a longer view like the simple way things are. A man who has been standing at the edge of a river for a long time will eventually become something like part of the river's scene, part of the landscape of the bank. Standing where he stands, look still while the water moves, cold where the water is cold, present in the way that being somewhere long enough produces presence. He is not the river, but he has been listening to it long enough that the distinction between listening and being partly absorbed is no longer entirely clear. The river does not notice him. The river continues as rivers continue, indifferent and unhurried, moving through the landscape with the ease of something that has been doing exactly this for longer than anyone standing on the bank has words to measure. The logos runs through the water and through the bank and through the man standing on the bank and through the question the man has begun tentatively to form about what he is looking at. The Tao moves through the water and through the high places and the low places and through the receptive quality of the attention turned toward it. The stream of consciousness moves through the man's mind the way the river moves through the landscape, not in pieces, not in stops and starts, but in one long continuous motion, each moment shaped by the moment before it, the whole thing going somewhere that cannot be determined from within the flow itself. The surveyor in ancient China lifts his palm from the silt and stands up slowly in the cold air after the flood. He does not write anything down. He carries what he read in the texture of the deposit inward, adds it to what he already knew, and begins to think about what the river will do next. He does not know exactly. The river has its own plans, if plans is the right word for the governing logic of a natural force that operates according to its own inherent nature without consulting anyone. He knows something about its tendencies. He has read its handwriting in the silt for long enough to recognize certain patterns, certain rhythms, certain ways the river returns to behaviors it has expressed before. This is not mastery of the river, but it is something quieter, a long familiarity, a knowledge built from attention rather than from imposition, a relationship that requires him to remain genuinely interested in what the river actually does, rather than in what he might prefer it to do. The afternoon light in James's study in Cambridge moved slowly across the wall as it had been moving all afternoon, the shadow of the window frame advancing at the particular pace of an autumn day in New England, unhurried, carrying the day toward its end without drama. James watched it for a while. The stream of consciousness ran on without him directing it, one thought opening quietly into the next, each transition smooth, each arrival already anticipating what would follow, the mind doing what the mind does when it is allowed to do it, flowing, finding its own course, coherent in the way of moving water. Beneath the frozen surface of a winter river, the current holds its course through the dark. The ice above it is real, and the stillness of the ice is real, but it is the stillness of a single layer placed over a depth that has not stopped. The water beneath continues to move with the particular patience of water that has no urgent schedule to keep, no arrival it is racing toward, no awareness of the ice above it as either obstacle or imposition. It simply continues as it has always continued, following the bed the land has shaped for it, carrying what it carries, going where rivers go, when left to go where they go. The surface stays still, the depth runs on. The reeds at the margin catch a faint tremor in the current somewhere beneath them, and sway very slightly in the cold air, and go still again, and somewhere downstream the river continues into the long country of the night, moving with the unhurried certainty of something that has been in motion for longer than the ice above it, and will be in motion long after the ice is gone. A student in a candlelit room holds a scroll open to the 78th chapter of the Tao Te Ching. The candle is small. The room is cold at its edges. She has been reading for an hour, and the line she keeps returning to is this one: "Nothing in the world is as soft and yielding as water, and yet nothing surpasses it for dissolving what is hard and inflexible." She reads it again, slowly. Then she sets the scroll down on the table and sits back in her chair with her hands in her lap, and the expression on her face is not understanding, but its opposite, the particular stillness of someone who has encountered a sentence that seems on its surface simple and has discovered, upon pressing gently, that the surface goes much deeper than expected. The line is not a metaphor. That is what she is beginning to sense. Laozi was not reaching for a pleasing image to illustrate a moral point. He was making a claim about the structure of the world, about how force actually operates across time, about what strength really is when the time available to it is long enough. The hardness of stone is not in question. The softness of water is not in question. What is in question is the assumption that hard things prevail over soft ones, that force wins over yielding, that the rigid outlasts the receptive. Given enough time, Laozi argues these assumptions reverse. What looked like weakness is revealed as the more durable form of strength. What looked like strength is revealed as the condition that made dissolution inevitable. She does not yet know what to do with this. The candle shortens. The room holds its cold at the edges and its warmth at the center, and she sits in the warmth and does not move. There is a word in the Tao Te Ching for the state of something that has not yet been shaped or differentiated: pu, the uncarved block. It refers most simply to a piece of wood before the craftsman has touched it, before the grain has been followed, before the form inside has been revealed, before any particular shape has been drawn out of the material and declared to be the one it should take. The uncarved block is not valuable because it is empty. It is valuable because it is not yet any one thing, which means it still contains the possibility of being all things. The moment a form is imposed, that particular potential is spent. The block becomes a table, a bowl, a wheel, and it is no longer able to become anything else. The carving is a kind of closing. Laozi uses this image not to argue against carving, not to suggest that nothing should ever be shaped, but to point at something about the nature of potential itself. The uncarved state is the condition of maximum creative possibility. Every act of differentiation produces something specific and loses something unrealized. This is not a tragedy. It is simply the nature of the movement from latent to actual, from the unnamed to the named, from the block to the form the block becomes. The point is to know what is being exchanged. The craftsman who does not know this reaches for his chisel in haste, cuts confidently along a line the grain does not support, and splits the wood. The craftsman who knows it pauses, looks, lets the material tell him something before he begins. There is a parable in Zhuangzi about a cook, and it has been read and returned to for 2,000 years for reasons that take time to settle into clarity. Prince Hui's cook is preparing an ox. The prince watches, and what he sees is something that does not look like work in the usual sense. The knife moves through the carcass with a sound like silk coming off a spool, or like music in a temple, and Prince Hui asks the cook how he has achieved such skill. The cook sets down his knife and explains that what he follows is not technique but Tao. He has given up relying on his eyes, he says. He works instead with his mind. He perceives the natural constitution of the animal, the cavities, the seams, the spaces between joint and tendon, and his knife passes through these spaces without resistance. He has used the same blade for 19 years. It is still as sharp as the day it left the grinder. What the cook describes is not the mastery of a craftsman over his material. It is something quieter than that, and stranger. He does not cut through the ox. He finds the places where the ox is already open and passes through them. His knife never meets bone because he never asks it to. The resistance that would dull the blade is never offered the blade to meet. And in the moment when he arrives at a difficult joint, he slows down, moves with particular care, applies only the slightest pressure, and the work comes apart before him. Zhuangzi returns to this parable again and again in different forms, because it holds something he is trying to say about the dissolution of the boundary between the self and the world it moves through. The cook is not imposing himself on the ox. He is not bending the animal to his will. By the end, it is not entirely clear where the cook's intention ends and the ox's own natural structure begins. The knife follows a path that was already there. The work is the gradual surrender of forcing in favor of following, and what is gained is not just efficiency, but something that looks from the outside like effortlessness, and from the inside, if the cook were to describe it, might feel like not working at all. She is still sitting in the candlelit room. She has not returned to the scroll yet. She is thinking about the way the line about water felt when she first read it, not as an argument she could agree or disagree with, but as something that had arrived in her chest before her mind had caught up with it. The philosophy of the Tao Te Ching does this often. It reaches the body first. Jigoro Kano was a Japanese educator in the late 19th century, a small man, and he had spent years studying the classical schools of jujutsu before arriving at the question that would define his life's work. Classical jujutsu had techniques for every situation: throws, holds, pins, escapes, accumulated over centuries of practical necessity. But something in the underlying principle had never been made fully explicit, never gathered into a single governing idea that could be taught directly. Kano spent years looking for that idea. He found it not in the techniques, but beneath them. Beneath every effective technique was the same principle operating. He called it jaw, which is usually translated as gentle or yielding, and he named the art he founded after it, judo, the gentle way. The principle he had found was this: an opponent's force need not be met with counterforce. When a large opponent pushes, the smaller practitioner does not push back. The smaller practitioner steps aside, or turns, or gives way just enough that the force has nothing to meet, and the larger body, committed to a push that found no resistance, falls through the empty space where resistance should have been. Kano expressed this in the maxim that became the heart of judo: maximum efficiency with minimum effort, not because the art is passive, not because the practitioner does nothing, but because the practitioner has learned that the most effective action begins with a willingness to yield, to take the shape the moment requires, rather than insisting on the shape that was planned. Kano arrived at this on his own, working from the practical tradition he had inherited through years of practice and careful thought. But the principle he was naming is the one Lossie had been describing in the water of chapter 78. When water meets stone, it does not push. It finds the grain, the seam, the small place where the stone is already slightly open, and it presses into that space and withdraws and presses again and withdraws. Over the time available to water, which is very long, the stone changes shape. The water does not. A student learning judo falls. This is the beginning of the practice. Before any throw is taught, the student must first learn to fall correctly, must learn how to meet the ground without bracing against it, how to receive the impact without tensing into a shape that the impact will break. The first 100 falls are work. The student braces, anticipates, locks the muscles that the technique requires to be soft. The ground arrives as a collision. On the 101st fall, or the 200th, or the 300th, the number is different for each person. Something shifts. The student stops bracing. The fall happens through the body rather than against it. And for the first time, the ground is simply the ground, arriving, which is not the same thing as a collision at all. This is what the student learns before any throw, that the body's first instinct, to resist, to hold, to meet force with counterforce, is the instinct that produces the most damage. The yield is not defeat. The yield is the beginning of movement, and movement is what makes a response possible. The body that is locked in resistance has nowhere left to go. The body that is yielded has the whole floor available. In a military tent somewhere near the Danube, Marcus Aurelius sat alone and wrote by the light of an oil lamp. He was the emperor of Rome, and he was conducting a long campaign on the northern frontier. And he was also, in the hours when the camp was quiet, writing the book that no one was ever supposed to read. The meditations were not written for publication. They were a practice, a philosopher's ongoing argument with himself, a record of what it felt like to apply Stoic principles to an actual human life, with all the friction that produced. He returns to the same themes again and again throughout the notebooks, because the themes keep needing to be returned to. He has not settled them. He is living with them. One of the images he comes back to is fire, not destructive fire, not fire as violence or catastrophe, but fire as a particular kind of intelligence operating through matter. He had been thinking about what an obstacle really is. The Stoics had long held that external events, illness, loss, political failure, the hostility of other people, were not in themselves bad, because nothing external was truly in one's power, and only what is in one's power can be good or bad in the way that matters. What one had power over was the interior movement, the response, the interpretation, the quality of attention brought to whatever arrived. But Marcus wanted to go further than this, or he wanted to feel it differently, and the image that helped him was fire. Fire, he wrote, devours whatever is thrown into it and uses it to burn more brightly. What would extinguish a smaller flame, a log, a quantity of air, more fuel than it can handle? Fire transforms into itself. The obstacle feeds the flame. The difficulty becomes the material of the response to the difficulty. He did not mean this sentimentally. He meant it as a description of a specific inner capacity, the capacity to receive what arrives however it arrives, and to find in it the material for continuing, not because everything that arrives is good, not because difficulty is secretly a gift, but because the fire that can receive what comes and transform it is more durable than the fire that requires particular conditions in order to burn. The image converges, without Aurelius having known it, with the water image of the Tao Te Ching. Both describe strength as a form of receptivity. Both locate the most durable power, not in resistance, but in the capacity to take the shape of what arrives, and in doing so to outlast it. The hard and the rigid, both traditions notice this, tend to break. The soft and the receptive tend to endure. The stone breaks at the point of greatest stress. The water passes around the stone and keeps moving. The student in the candlelit room has picked up the scroll again. She is reading the 78th chapter, more slowly now. Nothing is as soft and yielding as water. She has read enough to know that Lao Tzu means this, the way a mathematician means a proof, as something that follows necessarily from the nature of the things being considered. Once you have seen the nature of the things being considered clearly enough, she reads on, and yet for dissolving the hard and inflexible nothing surpasses it. She reads the line a third time, then she sets the scroll down and looks at the candle. There is a distinction that the Tao Te Ching keeps making in different forms across its 81 short chapters. The distinction is between two kinds of action, not between action and inaction, exactly though it touches that, but between action that imposes itself on the world and action that follows the grain of what is already there. A saw that cuts across the grain takes effort and leaves a rough edge. A saw that cuts along the grain moves almost without effort and leaves a surface that needs almost no work to finish. The wood is the same wood. The difference is in the direction of the cut, and the direction of the cut depends on whether the craftsman has taken the time to read the grain before beginning. This is not passivity. The craftsman is not sitting still. The cook with the perfect knife is not standing back from the ox and waiting. The judo student on the mat is not refusing to move. The Stoic emperor on the frontier is not retreating from the difficulty of governance. What each of them has is a particular quality of attention, a willingness to receive information from the situation before deciding what to do with it, a holding back of the first impulse long enough to see the seam, the natural hollow, the place where movement is already possible, without force. The yielding is not the end of the action, it is its beginning. There is a sculptor who sets down her chisel. The block of pale stone is in front of her. She has been working for a long time, or perhaps she has not yet begun. It is not always clear, from the outside, where work starts. She has her hands open in her lap. She is looking at the stone the way you might look at a face you are trying to understand, not staring, not analyzing, but taking it in as a whole, patient with it, willing to wait until something makes itself visible. The stone has not been touched by any tool. It is still the uncarved block, still in the state of maximum potential. She does not yet know what is inside it. She is trying to learn what is inside it before her own idea of what it should be gets in the way. This is the practice that Lazi calls pu, though the sculptor may never have heard the word. She is trying to perceive before she acts. She is trying to let the material have something to say before she begins saying things to it. Whatever she makes, it will come from the intersection of what she perceives in the stone and what she knows how to do with her hands. The more she perceives, the more the work will be the stone's own form, rather than an idea imposed upon it. The less she perceives, the more the work will be a fight, her intention against the stone's grain, her tool meeting resistance the stone did not have to offer. She sits. The room is still. The stone holds its silence. The parable of Cook Ding is often taken as an illustration of a skill so refined it looks like magic, the knife moving through the carcass without resistance, the work accomplished without apparent effort. And that is part of it. But there is another layer that takes longer to see. The cook has been practicing for 19 years. The knife has been in use for all that time. The blade has not dulled because in 19 years, practicing every day, the cook has never forced the cut, has never once asked the knife to do something the material was not already offering. This is a record of sustained attention over a very long time, 19 years of returning to the same practice, every day with the same quality of listening. The knife is sharp because the cook has always listened before cutting. The listening is not the preliminary to the work. The listening is the work. Fodzu understood something about patience. The Tao Te Ching does not offer quick solutions. It does not suggest that the soft overcomes the hard overnight, or that one turn at the millstone is enough to polish a stone smooth. What it offers is an orientation, a way of placing oneself in relation to the world that makes the process of change available without forcing it. Water does not hurry. Water does not press. Water finds the lowest place, settles there, and receives whatever arrives. And over the time available to water, which is very long, longer than any particular stone can hold its shape against, the stone becomes something else. The form the water takes it to is not a form the stone could have been forced into. It is a form that arrived through the patient conversation between one element and another across time. This is not easy to hold in the mind. It asks for a particular kind of faith, not religious faith, not certainty about outcomes, but faith in process, in the sufficiency of sustained, receptive attention over time. Most of the resistance people bring to the world comes from impatience, not cruelty, not failure of imagination, not even ignorance so much as the difficulty of waiting long enough for the grain to show itself before the first cut is made. The cook who rushes the work splits the bone. The sculptor who hurries past the looking stage cuts along a line the stone cannot support. The judo student who braces against the fall is the one who gets hurt. Marcus Aurelius, alone with his lamp in the tent, knew this. The meditations are a record of a man who has to remind himself of what he already knows. He knows the Stoic arguments. He has studied them for years. He knows that external events are not in themselves good or bad, that the quality of his response is what falls within his power, that the fire of a well-ordered interior can receive whatever arrives and use it. He knows this, and he still has to write it down again and again, because knowing something and having that knowledge available in the moment when the difficulty actually arrives are not the same thing. The practice is the returning, not the arrival at a conclusion, but the ongoing willingness to return. Each time the impatience rises, or the tendency to resist kicks in, to the same patient observation, what is actually here, and what is the grain of it, and where does it already want to go? She sets the scroll down a second time. The candle is shorter now. The room is very quiet. She has been sitting with chapter 78, long enough that the line has stopped being a philosophical claim and started to feel more like a description of something she recognizes, not from books, but from somewhere else, something older. The places in her own life where she pressed hard against something and the thing held firm, and the places where she released the pressure and found that what she had been pressing against was not an obstacle, but a door, and it moved easily in the direction she had not thought to try. She does not make this a large thought. She lets it stay small, lets it rest beside the candle without requiring anything of it. Outside, the night is deep. Whatever is out there is not asking to be resolved. The problems that feel most intractable, Lao Tzu seems to suggest, are the ones being approached from the wrong angle, not the wrong argument, not the wrong understanding, but the wrong direction. From the front, the stone is solid. At the grain, the stone is already, slowly, becoming something else. The change is already happening. The question is whether the effort being applied is helping or hindering it. Jigoro Kano taught this to his students for decades. Not as philosophy, he was a practical man, but as the direct experience of what a body learns when it stops bracing and starts listening. The student who has thrown someone for the first time using judo's principle does not understand it intellectually in that moment. The understanding is in the body, in the felt sense of how little effort was required, in the surprise of how far and how naturally the larger person fell. The body knows, before the mind has caught up, that something different just happened. The mind follows later and names it, and then the two together can begin to deepen it. The candle shortens. Outside the candlelit room, the night continues. The scroll rests on the table, with chapter 78 face up, the line about water visible but not being read. The student is not reading. She is sitting with what the reading left behind, and that is a different kind of work, or not work exactly, the kind of resting that is still, underneath, going somewhere. Cook Ding's knife rests on the block beside his finished work. Prince Hui has long since gone. The cook is alone in the kitchen, and the blade is still sharp, and the quiet in the room is the quiet of something completed. Not completed because it is done. There will be more work tomorrow, more carcasses, more cuts to make, but completed in the sense that everything the moment required has been given to it without holding back and without forcing. The seams have been followed. The natural hollows have been honored. The blade went where the material offered it passage and came back clean. This is what Lao Tzu is describing in the line about water, not the absence of force, but the intelligent, patient application of it. Applied where the material yields, withheld where the material resists, and trusted to do its work over the time it takes for the work to happen. The water is not idle. The water is doing the only thing that will actually work, which is to press gently at the seam, and wait, and press again, and wait, and let the stone arrive at a new shape through the accumulated patience of the water's own nature. Marcus Aurelius lifted his gaze from the page and looked at the lamp's flame for a long time. The flame consumed what it was given and burned more brightly. He held this in his attention the way he had learned to hold difficult things, without grasping, without forcing. The flame did not resist what was thrown into it. The flame received and transformed. He wrote the thought down, then set the pen aside, then looked at the flame again. The argument was not new. He had written something like it before. But the practice is the returning, and he returned to it, and the tent was very quiet around him. Outside, somewhere beyond the river, the night continued, unconcerned with argument, unconcerned with empire, patient in the way that all large things are patient, not because they have decided to be, but because patience is simply what very large things are when they are old enough. The student in the candlelit room has closed her eyes. The scroll is still there on the table. The line is still there on the scroll, available to be returned to tomorrow, or in a week, or in 10 years, when the meaning of it will have shifted again. Chapter 78 has not finished with her. She has not finished with it. This is the nature of these lines. They are not problems to be solved, but material to be lived with, and the living with them changes both the reader and the reading, slowly, over time, the way water changes stone. The candle burns. The room holds its warmth at the center. The cold at the edges of the room is patient, as cold is patient, as darkness is patient, not pressing, not forcing, simply remaining available for when the warmth recedes, which it will, in time, in the natural course of things. There is no urgency in this. It is simply the way the elements behave when left to themselves. The sculptor in the room with the uncarved block has not yet moved. Her hands are open in her lap. The stone is in front of her. She is still looking. Nothing has been decided. Nothing has been cut. The block is still the block, still full of everything it might become, still whole, still patient in the way that stone is patient, which is a patience much older than any intention she might bring to it. She will begin when she knows enough. She has not yet looked long enough. The looking is not the waiting. The looking is the first real work, and she is doing it. A very old willow stands at the edge of a riverbed in the hours just before morning, after a long winter storm. Every rigid tree in the surrounding grove has broken, clean fractures at the trunk, branches down in the snow, the weight of accumulated ice too much for wood that would not give. The willow is different. Its long branches are draped with the same ice, heavy, cold, pressing down, but the willow bent, not broke. Through the whole of the storm, through the long hours of accumulating weight, the willow went down with the weight, down and further down, its branches pressed almost to the ground, the tree becoming for a time a shape no one would recognize as a willow. And then the ice begins to melt in the first warmth of the returning morning. Slowly the weight lifts. Slowly the branches rise. The water drips from them in long silver threads, catching the first pale light. The tree is returning to its ordinary height, not hurrying, not insisting, simply returning, as the weight allows, in the direction it has always leaned. The branches are still wet, the ice is still going, the willow is still rising, slowly, as the morning continues to arrive. It will be, in another hour, exactly as it was before the storm, unhurt, whole, the branches moving lightly in the clearing air, in the way they have always moved, reaching, softly without insistence, toward the light. James Hutton pressed both palms flat against the cliff face, his fingers spread wide across the layered rock, his face turned upward to follow the strata as they climbed toward a gray Scottish sky. It was the late 18th century, and Hutton was a farmer turned natural philosopher, a man who had spent years watching his fields and begun to wonder what lay beneath them, not just in depth but in time. What his hands felt that afternoon on the cliff at Sicker Point was not simply stone. It was an argument, one the earth had been making for longer than any human language had existed to receive it. The layers beneath his fingers told a story he had not been prepared to read. At the base, ancient marine sediments had been compressed and tilted nearly vertical by forces so immense and so slow that the human mind had no natural category for them. Above that, resting at an angle so different as to seem impossible, lay a second series of layers, deposited millions of years later, as if the earth had simply begun again, had erased one chapter, and without ceremony started another. Between those two formations, folded into the contact between them, was a gap in the record so enormous that it swallowed the entire span of what Hutton had always thought of as geological time. He called it an unconformity. What he meant was, here is a silence in stone, and its duration is beyond measurement by anything I know. Hutton did not call this discovery by any dramatic name. He simply continued looking, his palms still flat, his eyes moving upward along the face of the cliff. When he finally spoke, according to the geologist who was with him that afternoon, he said only that he saw no vestige of a beginning and no prospect of an end. The sentence arrived quietly. It had the quality of something that had been true for a very long time before anyone was present to say it. What the cliff at Sicker Point had shown Hutton was not merely that the earth was old. It had shown him that the scale by which human beings had always measured time, the span of a life, the reach of a dynasty, the length of recorded history, was not the scale on which the earth operated. The earth had its own patience. It did not compress its processes to fit any observer's attention. It had been doing what it did long before attention existed, and the rock under Hutton's hands carried the record of that vast, unwitnessed duration in every stratum, every fold, every tilted plane of ancient sediment. All of recorded human history, Hutton understood that afternoon, occupied something like the outermost film of the total, not even a layer, a surface. There is a Taoist concept for the particular quality Hutton had encountered in that cliff, the quality of something unfolding entirely according to its own inherent nature, without external compulsion, without being hurried by anything outside itself. The word is Ziran. It translates roughly as naturalness, or self-so, or the condition of being exactly what one is without any effort toward becoming something else. A cliff face expresses Ziran. A river expresses it. The slow drift of sediment through cold water, settling without intention into what will become, given sufficient time, a layer of stone. This too is Ziran, the world proceeding at its own pace in perfect accordance with what it is. Ziran carries a temporal implication that is easy to miss if one approaches it only as a description of natural behavior. The implication is this: the most profound processes have their own inherent rhythm, and that rhythm cannot be safely hurried. Not merely that hurrying is ineffective, that it distorts, that to accelerate what has its own natural pace is to produce something other than what the process, left to itself, would have made. The carving of a river valley requires the time it requires. The slow accumulation of understanding in a person's life proceeds the way it proceeds. To demand either arrive sooner is not to receive an earlier version of the same thing. It is to receive something else entirely, something with the shape of the destination, but without the quality that only the full duration could have given it. Hutton was not a Taoist. He was a Scottish natural philosopher who grew potatoes and read Latin and spent his weekends breaking open rocks. But what he found in that cliff was something the Taoists had been saying in a different register for more than 2,000 years. That the world operates on a timescale that makes human urgency look, from the right distance, like a brief and slightly puzzled trembling on the surface of something very old and very steady. The geologist runs her finger along the cliff face now, not Hutton, but one of the many who have come after him, tracing the line between the two formations, the ancient tilted beds below, the younger horizontal ones above, with a touch so careful it might be tenderness. She has read the argument Hutton made here and the arguments it generated, the long, slow revolution in thought that followed from his recognition that the earth required deep time to have become what it is. She moves her finger very slowly, counting layers the way one might count the pages of a book, so long that no single life could hold its entirety. She does not hurry this. The counting itself is not a means to some end waiting further on. The counting is the thing. Between these two formations under her fingertip lies the unconformity, the gap, the silence, the compressed record of everything that happened and was not preserved. Millions of years, perhaps hundreds of millions. The gap is not empty. It simply holds what erosion took before the next cycle of deposition began. What is absent is not nothing. It is time without a witness, duration without a record, the world proceeding in perfect accordance with its own nature, while nothing watched and nothing noted it down. Something about this does not diminish the gap. It makes it, if anything, more present. What was not recorded still happened. The stone does not require a witness to be shaped. A leaf falls in the late afternoon outside the monastery window, and the woman seated at the low desk does not follow it with her eyes. She has been sitting for a long time, and the distinction between sitting for a long time and sitting for a short time has become less clear than it was when she first sat down. This is one of the things the practice does. Over months and years, it loosens the grip of the clock on the quality of experience, not by dissolving time, but by shifting one's relationship to it, from the relationship of someone who is using time toward a destination to something more like the relationship of someone who is simply inside time, the way a stone inside a river is inside the river, moved by it, but not straining against it. There is a word in the Buddhist tradition for the quality of experience this practice is orienting toward: anicca, the impermanence of all conditioned things, not just the obvious impermanences, the summer that becomes autumn, the friendship that cools, but the subtler ones, the thought that arises and passes, the sensation that comes and goes, the quality of attention itself, shifting from one moment to the next in ways too fine-grained to track without a very particular kind of stillness. Anicca is not primarily a teaching about loss. The way the tradition develops it, it is a teaching about the nature of what is there, before the mind adds the story of loss. A flower is not failing when it wilts. It is expressing its nature completely, including the part of its nature that consists in changing. The woman at the desk has been working with this for years, not as a concept, but as something observed. A thought arises. Not that it arises. She does not commentate on the arising. Simply, there it is. And then it shifts, and then something else. The practice does not stop the arising of thoughts, or smooth the quality of experience into something even and featureless. It changes the relationship to what arises, from identification, from the sense that the thought is the self thinking it, to something closer to witnessing, the way one watches weather move across an open hillside, with interest, without the assumption that the weather is about the watcher. What this produces over time is not detachment in the cold sense. It is something more like the equanimity of a field that has weathered many seasons and found over the long run that none of them was final. The summer was not the end, and neither was the winter. Each arose, expressed itself completely, and gave way to the next. The field, through all of it, remained a field, not unchanged, different, season to season, accumulating the record of everything that had passed over it, but continuous in a way that had nothing to do with remaining the same. Continuous, the way a river is continuous, carrying new water always, and always the river. There is a French philosopher of the 20th century who developed a closely related practice by an entirely different path. Boo! Simone Weil sat at a plain wooden desk with a pencil in her hand and a mathematical problem in front of her, and did not touch it. This was not procrastination. It was, for Weil, one of the most demanding things a mind could do, to remain present to a difficulty without moving immediately to resolve it, to hold the problem in full attention without pressing it toward an answer, to wait, actively, strenuously, without the ego's drive to possess and complete, for what the problem itself might eventually yield. She called this attente, patient, receptive waiting. The word carries less passivity in French than its translation might suggest. Wheels attente was not the waiting of someone who has set a thing down and walked away. It was the waiting of someone who has brought their full presence to bear and then held it there steady, without forcing. The pencil remains in the hand. The attention remains on the problem. Nothing moves except perhaps the quality of the attention itself, deepening over time into something that can receive what an impatient mind would never reach. What Wheel was describing, though she arrived at it through a very different set of sources, had something in it of Ziran, the natural process proceeding at its own pace, the recognition that certain things cannot be compelled without being distorted. A solution forced is often not quite the solution the problem was waiting to give. A relationship pressed toward resolution before its own internal process has completed often produces a settlement that holds for a time and then shows its seams. Understanding arrived at too quickly carries the particular fragility of things that were hurried, not quite wrong, but lacking the density that only duration could have supplied. Wheel's student, pencil in hand, not yet writing, was practicing a respect for the pace of the thing itself. This was, for her, a moral as much as an intellectual discipline. The flame of the oil lamp on the desk moves slightly, and Wheel does not look up. The problem is still in front of her. She is not closer to its solution, or she may be. She cannot tell, from inside the waiting, whether proximity to a solution is something that can be felt. What she can feel is the attention, how it has a texture, how it changes as the minutes pass, how it is possible to hold something in mind with a quality of presence that is entirely different from grasping it. She has written about this distinction. She will keep returning to it in different registers for the rest of her working life. The discipline is the same each time, to be wholly present to what is difficult, without demanding that the difficulty resolve itself on the ego's schedule. Marcus Aurelius was riding in a military tent somewhere on the northern frontier of the Roman Empire in the last decade of his life, when he paused mid-sentence and looked up at the opening of the tent. The darkness outside was complete. The encampment beyond it was a field of fires and low voices, and the particular concentrated restlessness of soldiers who had been on campaign too long and were not yet asleep. Aurelius looked at the darkness for a moment, and then his gaze, or something in his imagination that served the function of a gaze, began to ascend. He had practiced this ascent many times. The Stoics had a name for it, or rather the practice had a name that the philosopher Pierre Hadot, writing about Marcus Aurelius in the 20th century, would later make prominent: the view from above. The exercise was simple in its description and demanding in its execution. From the position of one's physical location, one ascends in imagination, first to the roof of the building or the top of the hill, seeing the surrounding landscape spread out below. Then further, until the city is visible as a shape, its streets and walls reduced to pattern. Further still, until the whole territory is visible, and then the continent, and then the curve of the earth itself against the darkness of space. And from that altitude, the small urgencies of the day, the letter that had not been answered, the official who had given offense, the decision that felt unbearably pressing, were revealed to be not nothing, but to be what they were: particular concerns of a particular life, located in a particular moment, within a much larger fabric of events and circumstances that had been unfolding for an immensely long time and would continue long after the present concern had resolved or been forgotten. This was not a practice of dismissal. Aurelius was not training himself to care less about his responsibilities. He was training himself to hold them at their actual scale, neither inflated by the distortions of proximity, nor so reduced by the vast perspective that they lost their weight entirely. The view from above was a corrective lens, something to turn toward when the urgency of the immediate moment had swollen beyond the actual size of the thing. It did not deny that things mattered. It was more like what the cliff face had shown Hutton, a change of scale that changed everything about how the particular looked, without changing what the particular was. Aurelius looked at the dark opening of the tent for another moment and then lowered his gaze back to the page. The sentence he had left unfinished was still there. It was about the quality of impermanence, about how every generation of humanity had watched the people before them pass away and replace them, how every great empire eventually returned to the ground from which it had grown, how even those things that seemed most permanent were moving at a pace simply too slow for a single life to register. He did not find this a source of despair. He found it, after years of sitting with it, something closer to relief. Not the relief of caring less, but the relief of having placed one's cares inside a frame large enough to hold them without distortion. The tent's opening moved slightly in a night wind from the north, and Aurelius heard the fires outside shifting, the particular sound of burning wood settling into itself. He looked at the page again, set the pen down. There was time. Not in the sentimental sense of that phrase, not the comforting assurance that everything would work out. Time in the literal sense. The night was long, the problem was not going anywhere, and the understanding he was working toward would not be hurried by pressure. It had its own pace. What he could do was show up to it, consistently, with as much honesty as he could manage. The view from above, and the practice of a tental, and the observation of a Nika in the meditator's mind, and the geologist's tracing finger moving along the unconformity, these are not the same practice. They come from different centuries, different continents, different intellectual traditions with different vocabularies and different ends, but in each of them, something similar is at work: the voluntary expansion of the frame, the deliberate loosening of the grip that ordinary urgency keeps on the available moment, the allowing of a larger scale to enter the field of attention and adjust the apparent weight of what is most immediately pressing. In each of them, too, there is the same implicit recognition that this expansion is not passive. It costs something. While Zatonte was a discipline, Aurelius's ascending view was a practice he returned to, not because it came naturally, but because without it, the distortions of proximity reasserted themselves. The geologist does not read the cliff face quickly. The meditator who watches thoughts arise and pass without becoming them has spent a long time learning to watch in that way. The patience required by Ziron is not simply the patience of doing nothing and waiting. It is the patience of remaining genuinely present to a process that has its own pace, without imposing the alternative pace that urgency recommends. Hutton, back on the cliff at Secare Point, had not simply waited for the cliff to teach him. He had spent years before that afternoon developing the attention that could receive what the cliff had to say. The reading of strata, the inference of time from the angle of deposition, the recognition of an unconformity for what it was, rather than for what a shorter timescale might have led him to expect. These were the products of a sustained and careful practice of attention. The cliff had always held what it held. The years of preparation were what made it possible for Hutton to hear the argument the cliff was making. A slow river moves through autumn landscape in the last hour of afternoon light, and on its surface a single yellow leaf is traveling. The leaf did not plan this journey. It did not choose the current that carries it or the direction in which the current runs. It is simply on the water, and the water is moving, and in that arrangement, the leaf covers an enormous distance without effort, without intention, without any action other than the action of remaining on the surface. The river takes it past the gray roots of an oak at the bank, past a long, smooth bend where the current slows slightly, past a stretch where the water shallows over stones, and the leaf trembles with the texture of the bottom it cannot see. It travels, in the late afternoon, further than it could have traveled by any other means. There is something in this image that has nothing to do with passivity. The leaf is not absent. It is wholly present to each moment of the journey. The shadow of the oak, the particular quality of light on the slow bend, the trembling over the stones. It simply is not fighting the pace of the thing carrying it. This is not resignation. It is something much more specific than that. The recognition that the pace of the river is the actual pace of the journey, and that any adjustment the leaf might make to that pace would not be an improvement on the river's motion, but a disturbance of it. The Buddhist meditator at the monastery knows something about this. She has watched enough thoughts travel through her attention to understand that following them more slowly does not lose anything essential, that the thought which arises and is given full attention as it passes, without being grasped or pushed away, delivers something in its passing that the grasped thought never does. The leaf carried easily, the leaf at the natural pace of the water. She does not press the simile into anything more formal than that. It arrives, she notices it, and it moves on, the way everything does, the way it has always done, in the world Hutton held in his palms, on the cliff face, and the world Aurelius looked at from the height of his ascending imagination, and the world Weil sat with, pencil still, in full and patient attendance. The quality that connects these practices is not a philosophical position, so much as an orientation, an alignment with something rather than against it. The recognition that certain things proceed at their own pace, and that the pace is not incidental to what they are, that the slowness of geological formation is not merely how long it takes to make stone, but part of what makes stone what it is, the compression, the density, the layers of what preceded it, folded into the structure of what it has become. Hurried stone would be something else. Forced understanding, too, is something else. And the equanimity that comes from genuinely sitting with large questions over a long time, not resolving them, not managing them, but living in their company, is something that hurrying produces only the appearance of, never the substance. The autumn afternoon is deepening into early evening, and the slow river is moving in the particular low light that comes in the last hour before dark, when everything near the ground seems lit from within rather than from above. The leaf is still on the water. It has covered a considerable distance. It will cover more before the current brings it to wherever the current is going, and nothing about the journey has required the leaf to know in advance where that is. The not knowing has not been an obstacle. It has been, in some sense, the condition that made the traveling possible at all. The openness of the thing carried by the thing that carries it, moving at the pace of the world rather than the pace of its own impatience. James Hutton, back in Edinburgh, would write up what he had found at Sicker Point. He would write carefully, in the plain prose of a man more interested in being accurate than impressive, and what he would produce was a theory of the earth that gave subsequent generations a new kind of time to live inside, not a longer version of the old time, a different quality of time entirely, one in which the span of a human life or a civilization was not the basic unit against which everything else was measured, but simply one scale among many, each real, each holding its own kind of truth, none of them the only one. This is what deep time actually gives, if it is genuinely received rather than simply noted. Not the dizzying vertigo of realizing that one is small against an immense backdrop. That is one way of receiving it, but it is the way of having brought one's ordinary scale to a larger one and found oneself diminished by the comparison. The other way of receiving it is the way Hutton received it, standing at the cliff face with both palms flat on the rock, as an expansion of what counts as time, a widening of the frame in which the immediate moment is held. From inside that wider frame, the urgencies do not disappear. They take their actual size, and their actual size almost always turns out to be something one can carry without fighting. The yellow leaf has moved further on. The light has changed. The geologist has moved her finger another inch along the unconformity, reading the silence between the strata, counting the time that left no record except its own enormity. Marcus Aurelius in the tent has picked up the pen again. Vell's pencil is still held above the page, the problem still there in front of her, the attention still full, and still holding what it holds without pressing it toward the answer it has not yet offered. The meditator at the monastery window has watched another thought arise and pass, and the practice continues, season into season, the way all patient practices continue, not building toward a completion, but simply being what they are. Each moment of the practice, the whole of what the practice is. There is a slowness that is not inertia. It is worth staying with that distinction, because the two look similar from a distance and feel entirely different from inside them. Inertia is the stillness of something that has stopped. The slowness being pointed at here is the slowness of something proceeding at exactly the pace its nature requires, the river moving at the pace of the gradient, and the volume and the resistance of the bed, the rock forming at the pace of the heat and the pressure and the time available, the understanding, ripening at the pace of the experience that is composing it. This kind of slowness is not delay. It is the pace at which the thing actually happens, as opposed to the faster pace at which one might have hoped it would happen. The distinction changes what one is waiting for, not the arrival of something that is taking too long, the unfolding of something that is taking exactly as long as it takes, which is the only form in which it will arrive whole. The slow river carries the yellow leaf through the last of the afternoon light and into the long dimming that precedes evening. The leaf does not resist the dimming. The current does not slow for it. The world continues at its own pace, which has always been the only pace the world knows. And the leaf is carried a little further on, still moving, still unhurried, traveling an enormous distance by the simple practice of remaining on the surface of what is already in motion, going where it goes, arriving somewhere it did not plan to go, carried gently and without urgency by something that has been moving for a very long time and will continue moving long after any particular leaf has come to rest. Zhuangzi woke before the room had color. The ceiling above him was the same pale nothing it always was in that first moment, before the mind names what it sees, before the familiar shapes of walls and roof reassemble themselves into a dwelling known and returned to. He lay still. His body held something from the dream, not a memory of it, not a narration that could be repeated, but a physical residue, the way a hand retains warmth for a moment after setting down a cup. The sensation was of having moved through air without the usual effort of moving through air, of having crossed open distances without the ordinary weight of crossing. It was already leaving him, that sensation, thinning the way color thins from a coal as it cools, and he made no effort to hold it back. He had been a butterfly, or something that the dream called a butterfly, something that had not thought of the word butterfly, that had not needed the word, that had simply been the movement in the light and the passage through space between one moment and the next. Now he was Wangzi again, or the thing the waking world calls Wangzi, lying on a mat with the particular weight that flesh always has in the first minutes after sleep, heavier than it will be once the day has been fully entered. Between these two states, the dream and the waking, the butterfly and the man, there was a threshold he was still lying on, eyes open to a ceiling he had not yet troubled himself to recognize as his. The question came slowly, not as an argument, not as a challenge, but as a genuine uncertainty that had nowhere to settle, which was dreaming and which was not. He was a philosopher, which meant he had spent considerable time learning which questions were answerable and which were not, and what the difference between those two kinds of questions felt like from the inside. This one had the quality of the second kind. It was not a question that would yield to cleverness, or to patience, or to the gathering of more evidence. It was a question that pointed at the place where categories themselves thin and become unreliable. It was a question that pointed at the place where categories themselves thin and become unreliable. It was a question that pointed at the place where categories themselves thin and become unreliable, where what seems most certain, the boundary between sleeping and waking, between being oneself and being something else entirely, reveals itself in the actual moment of examination to be less sharp than habit suggests. He held the question with the same quiet he had given the ceiling. He did not move to resolve it. Outside, the morning was assembling itself in the usual order, bird sound before light, light before warmth, the whole slow opening of another day, arriving without any particular urgency. What Zhangzi had found, lying there, was something that Tao Te Ching had been pointing at long before him, not toward the answer, but toward the shape of the question and toward the posture, the inner posture, still and open, from which the question could be held without becoming a source of distress. The Tao, as Laozi had written it, was not a fixed ground beneath the flux, but the flux itself, ordered from within, moving according to a nature that needed no external instruction. And a life that moved like that, from its own center, following its own grain, yielding when yielding was called for, and holding still when stillness was required. Such a life did not need to insist on which of its moments was the real one. The butterfly moment and the Zhuangzi moment were both within the transformation. Neither canceled the other. Both were figures in what the text called the great transformation of things, the unending movement of forms into and through and out of one another, none of which is the last form, all of which are passing. A stone lifted from a river fits into a palm as though it was always going to be there. It is the right size, the right weight, its surface neither rough nor slippery, but exactly what the hand expects from something that has arrived at its final form through a process that did not hurry. Every curve of it is a record, not a record anyone sat down and wrote, not a record that required intention or attention from the river, but a record nonetheless, as accurate as any kept, the record of the water that moved around it, the particular pressure of each current at each season, the quiet insistence of one element against another across time, measured not in years, but in the accumulation of small patient actions, each too small to be visible, each adding something imperceptibly to the shape that was being slowly, continuously made. The stone was not fighting the river was not trying to change the stone. These are the wrong frames. What was happening between them had no adversarial structure, no contest, no moment at which one side had more or less of what the other was taking or giving. There was simply contact and duration, and the slow responsiveness of matter to what surrounds it, which is another way of saying that the stone became what the river made possible, and the river became what the stone's resistance guided, and neither remained what it had been, and neither knew this was happening, and it happened anyway, with perfect faithfulness to a process that required no observer to continue. This is what D points toward. D is the second great term in the Tao Te Ching, and it is harder to hold than the Tao itself, because the Tao can at least be gestured at through negation. It is not this, not that, not anything the naming mind can close its hand around, while D requires a different kind of attention, the kind that looks at a particular thing and asks not what category it belongs to, but what it is when it is most fully itself. D is not a virtue in the ordinary sense, not a quality acquired through effort and applied through decision. It is closer to the quality of the river stone that has been shaped by a force larger than any choice, the way that stone, having been fully worked on by what surrounded it, now embodies exactly and only what it is, without remainder, without distortion, without the gap between what a thing is and what it might have been if different forces had found it. A person has D when the particular way the Tao moves through that person is expressed without obstruction, not performed, not cultivated through a program of self-improvement, not constructed by the will from materials selected for the purpose, simply present the way the smoothness of the river stone is present, having arrived there without anyone deciding it should arrive. The word for this is not virtue in the moral sense and not character in the psychological sense, though it touches both. It is closer to the idea of a thing that has been fully shaped into what it was always in the process of becoming, so that looking at it from the outside, you would say only, yes, that is that thing, and it is entirely that thing, and nothing else is present that should not be there. Heraclitus had reached toward the same edge from a different direction, standing on cold, wet stones at the bank of a river outside Ephesus, watching the current move over and around the rocks in the stream bed. What he saw, or what he thought he saw clearly enough to stake a philosophical position on, was that the identity of the river was not a fixed thing resting beneath the flux, but a pattern within the flux, maintained by the flux, inseparable from it. The river is not the water. The river is the shape that water takes and maintains through its ongoing movement, the particular curve of this bend, the particular turbulence at this narrowing, the particular calm of this wide, shallow place, where the current spreads out and slows and deposits whatever it has been carrying. Remove the water, and there is no river. Still the water, and there is no river. The river exists only as a moving, only as a continuous passage of something through a form that the passage itself creates and maintains. This was a claim about everything, not about rivers. Rivers were simply the place where the claim became visible, where a mind standing at the edge could watch with its own eyes the very process that was occurring, invisibly, in all things at all times, in stone, in thought, in whatever a person is, across the decades of a life. Nothing rests on a fixed substrate. Nothing is underlain by a permanent self-identical core that the changes merely happen to. What has the quality of a continuous thing, this river, this mind, this life, is a pattern of organization within change, a logos that governs the movement without standing apart from it, the way the river's shape governs without standing apart from the water that is always new. Heraclitus wrote very little, and what he wrote was difficult, and he seemed to know this, and to value it, not to perform obscurity, but because the thing he had seen did not fit neatly into the structures that direct statement provides. The fragment about the river has been re-quoted and re-examined for more than 2,000 years, not because it is enigmatic in a decorative way, but because it is genuinely difficult in a productive way. It makes a claim that the mind wants to resist, and then, in the act of resistance, the mind finds that it cannot hold its ground against it, and the falling back is the beginning of understanding something it will not easily unfeel. The same feeling, that particular quality of a resistance giving way, was present in a quiet room in Zurich in the 20th century, and in many such rooms in many such cities when a patient left a session carrying something that had shifted without being named. Carl Jung had spent decades trying to describe the process accurately, and the best description he had found was also a provisional one. Individuation, he called it, the gradual process by which a self becomes more fully itself, integrating what had been unconscious and excluded and folded away into shapes the waking mind could not see. The word he used, individuation, means something like the process of becoming undivided, of arriving at a wholeness not achieved by ignoring or defeating internal divisions, but by moving through them, carrying them into consciousness, the way a river carries its sediment, and setting them down somewhere further along in a new configuration. The self that emerges from this process, Jung thought, is not the self that set out. It is a self shaped by something larger than the ego's intentions, shaped by the deep material of the psyche, the way the stone is shaped by the river, through contact with forces that were always present, but not always visible, working slowly and without announcing their work, and arriving eventually at a form that could not have been predicted from the beginning, but that once arrived at, seems to have been somehow necessary. He was careful to say that this process could not be forced. The ego that tried to accelerate it, to take the shaping into its own hands and sculpt the self according to a plan, produced distortion rather than depth. The timing belonged to something other than the ego's impatience. The process moved at its own pace, according to its own nature, toward an end it had always been moving toward, carrying the person who submitted to it further along than the person could have navigated by choice. There is a convergence here that neither man could have known about. Jung in Zurich had not spent significant time with the Tao Te Ching, and Laozi and the Zhou dynasty had no anticipation of depth psychology. Yet what they were pointing at from their different centuries and their different languages and their different methods was recognizably the same gesture, toward the place where effort runs into its limit, where the will discovers that what it is trying to build is already in the process of being built by something it cannot control, and where the right response is not to stop, but to yield, to join the movement rather than to direct it, to follow the grain of the material rather than to force through it. Kukding had known this, or rather Zhuangzi had told the story of Kukding in a way that made it clear what knowing this was like from the inside. The cook who stands before an ox with a cleaver does not think about the structure of the animal. He does not consult a diagram or plan his approach. After long practice, he has moved past the stage where he saw the whole animal as something to be cut through, past the stage where he felt the resistance of sinew and bone as obstacles to be defeated, into the stage where the cleaver finds the natural openings, the places where the structure of the thing parts of its own accord for whatever passes along its grain. The blade stays sharp because it encounters, in the places it goes, nothing that does not make room for it. The mastery is not the mastery of force, but the mastery of attention, the attention that has become so fine and so responsive that it perceives the natural seams before they are reached and moves into them without friction. In that suspended moment, the cleaver held in the air between one stroke and the next, the cook's face carrying the expression of someone listening rather than working, the boundary between the one who cuts and the thing being cut has gone quiet, not disappeared, not erased, but quiet. There is no opposition. There is the movement that the situation calls for, and there is the one who moves, and they are no longer, at this moment, entirely distinct. This is what Wu Wei arrives at when it is genuinely practiced rather than merely described. Wu Wei is not passivity. It has been called non-action, but this is a bad translation, or rather, a translation that requires immediate correction, because what it points at is not the absence of action, but action that arises so fully from the nature of the situation and the nature of the one acting that no gap remains between the intention and the act, no overlay of forcing, no imposition of a will that is not already in complete accord with what the moment requires. The Stoic tradition had its own name for the inner faculty that makes this possible, prohairesis, the capacity for self-directed rational choice, which Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus both held was the only thing genuinely in one's own power, and whose cultivation consisted precisely in learning to want what one could not refuse, to move with the grain of what is, to find in the necessity of circumstances not a cage but a floor from which the one clear act can rise. These two traditions, the Taoist and the Stoic, arrived at their conclusions by very different routes, and the differences between them are real and should not be flattened. But they converge here, in this place where the philosophy of action touches the philosophy of nature, and both say something similar, that the self shaped by a force larger than itself, which moves with that force rather than against it, is not a diminished self. It is a self that has arrived at the form it was always in the process of becoming. It is a self that has become, in some sense, the stone the river made. Marcus Aurelius spent his last years writing in a tent at the edge of an empire he had not chosen to inherit and could not refuse to govern. Meditations were not written for anyone else, not intended for publication, not shaped by an awareness of being read, and this is part of what makes them strange and close. They are a man talking to himself, which is to say, a man engaged in the practice of philosophy as it was meant to be practiced, not as a set of positions to be stated and defended, but as a discipline applied to the actual texture of a life that was difficult in the ways lives are difficult, and that had to be lived through nonetheless. He wrote about the view from above, the practice of imagining the whole of the encampment from altitude, then all of Rome, then all of time, until the urgency of whatever was pressing on him that day had reduced itself to its actual proportion, which was very small, which was almost nothing, which was held inside a process so much larger than any one day's difficulty, that the difficulty could be rested in rather than wrestled with. He is setting down the pen for the last time now, or at least for the last time on this particular evening. He does not know it will be, as it turns out, one of the last evenings, and this not knowing is part of what makes the gesture clean. The hand comes to rest on the open page. The writing has not resolved anything. It was never meant to resolve anything. What it was meant to do was train the mind into the posture of the one who yields, not yield to failure, not yield to despair, but yield to the immensity of what surrounds a single life, to the river that has been moving long before this life arrived at its bank, and will continue its movement long after. The hand rests on the page. The flame of the oil lamp holds its breath in the still air of the tent. Outside, whatever urgency the day had contained has gone quiet, and the night is simply the night. The river stone, it arrived in a hand through a simple act of reaching down, through cold, clear water, to the pale gray shape, resting in the dark of the stream bed, where the current had placed it, after however many years of carrying it from wherever it began. Its surface has the quality that only patient process produces, not polished, not worked over by a craftsperson with a tool and an intention, but worn, which is a different thing, a result that has no identical method, that cannot be replicated in an afternoon by someone who wants the appearance of it without the time. The stone knows, in whatever way a stone can know, nothing about the river. It has no relationship to the water in any sense that involves awareness. And yet the record of the river is written into every surface of it, into the precise geometry of its curvature, into the exact distribution of its weight across a palm, into the smooth place where the hardest current struck it most directly for the longest time, and there the surface is most finished, most completely arrived at what it is. A person who has lived long enough begins to have something of this quality, not through achievement, not through the successful execution of a plan, but through the patient accumulated pressure of everything the life has brought, of disappointment held and set down, of loss absorbed and carried a while before being released to the current, of joy received without hoarding, of the thousand small and large encounters with a world that does not arrange itself according to any single will. The one who has been fully worked on by a life, who has not resisted the working, who has followed the grain wherever the grain led, and yielded at the places where yielding was called for. That one has a quality the Tao Te Ching was pointing at when it wrote of D, the virtue that is not a virtue, but a kind of deep accord between what a thing is and what it does. The smoothness of a form that has been shaped by something it cannot name and need not name. Zhuangzi's butterfly was that, the butterfly who did not think the word butterfly, who was simply the movement and the light, that figure in the dream, had to fitting in the way only creatures who are entirely what they are can have it. It did not wonder whether it was flying correctly. It had no theory of flight, no anxiety about the efficiency of its trajectory, no awareness of what a butterfly is supposed to do versus what this butterfly was actually doing. It was the thing itself, undivided and entire, moving through air that was simply what surrounded it, expressing without effort or intention the particular form of the Tao that moved through that small winged moment of the world. Waking into the question whether the man is the real one or the butterfly, Zhuangzi lay still. He was still lying still. The ceiling was acquiring color now, the faint gray of early light, finding the edges of things, giving back to the room its familiar dimensions. He would rise shortly. He would eat and walk and talk with whoever came to talk, and the day would arrange itself the way days do, unexpectedly, one thing leading not always to the thing expected, the shape of it only visible in retrospect as having been a shape at all. And inside all of that, somewhere beneath the surface of the ordinary succession of hours, the great transformation would continue its patient movement, carrying this form a little further toward what it was always becoming, setting down here what it had been carrying from there, picking up here what it would carry to somewhere else, with no record kept, and no arrival announced, and nothing resolved or completed, but everything always in motion. There is a windowsill somewhere, and on it a stone that was taken from a river. The room around it is quiet in the early morning. The light has not yet reached the stone. It is arriving, moving across the floor at the pace that light moves when no one is watching it move, and the stone is still cool from the night, holding the particular dark cool of something that sat through all the night hours in the open air and has not yet received what the morning is bringing. The stone is the color of old water, pale gray with the faint suggestion of blue that some river stones carry, a color that is not quite either thing, but is the thing that results when those two are mixed by the indifferent chemistry of stone and time. Every surface of it is finished in the sense that nothing remains that was not meant to remain. Whatever was excess, whatever had not been asked for by the river, whatever the current could reach and work on, is gone, removed not by any intention, but by the ordinary long continued pressure of one thing against another, which is the only process that produces this particular quality of surface, and no other. The light is reaching it now, slowly, the pale bar of early morning, laying itself across the window sill from the left side toward the right, and the stone receives the warmth of it with the same equanimity with which it received the coldness of the night, as the river stone receives everything, with no preference for one condition over another, no resistance to what arrives, no holding on to what passes. The warmth enters the stone slowly. Stone warms slowly, holds warmth long, releases it gradually into the cool that will follow when the light moves on. This is also the record of what the stone is, its thermal patience, the way it holds what it has been given and releases it in its own time, in its own way, at its own pace. This, too, is a form of the particular expression of the Tao in this piece of matter that is like no other piece of matter, shaped like no other stone, holding the light in the exact way that only this stone holds it.